Hello and welcome to Camino Talks. I'm Sean from Follow the Camino, and with me today is Keith Foskett, who is a long distance hiker and an author of 4 books about his adventures. Welcome to the show, Keith.
Morning, Sean. Hi.
Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking me.
So, Keith, you've written 4 books about various travels, but before we go into that, maybe just give a little bit of a background about yourself, where you're from, who you are. You don't mind?
At the moment, I'm a full-time writer. I'm originally from a little village called Billingshurst, which is near Horsham in West Sussex. I grew up around the South Downs in Sussex. I got into hiking. Well, I got into walking when I was about 16 or 17, I suppose. I've done 3 Caminos. The first one was in 2001, which really got me into the long distance hiking bug. Didn't do any more long distance trips until 2010 when I did the Pacific Crest Trail in America. In 2012, I did the Appalachian Trail in America. 2015, I had an unsuccessful attempt on the Continental Divide Trail in America. Got to about a mile 550. Had some medical issues, and after that I've done the Camino a further 2 times, and in amongst all of that I hike across Scotland and stuff like the North Downs Way, the Ridgeway, Cape Wrath Trail, lots of other hikes around the UK, and my full-time occupation now is to write about it.
Very good, very good. So I understand before you'd ever heard of the Camino, you were probably sitting on a bar in an island in Greece, kind of enjoying yourself. So maybe tell us how you got from there to undertaking your first Camino.
I was working at a yoga retreat on the south coast of Crete. This was back in 2001. I finished work there around about the beginning of August, and had about kind of 2.5 months of the summer left. Decided I wanted to do something with it, and I'd always wanted to do a long hike. And when I say a long hike, you know, upwards of a month or so. I didn't really know, or I hadn't even heard of the Camino at this point. I didn't really know which walk to do, other than the fact that I wanted it to kind of be in the Mediterranean, to take advantage of the later summer down there, as opposed to somewhere like the UK. And I was flying back home. I was in Heraklion, which is a city on the north coast of Crete, and I was in a bar in the youth hostel and just got talking to a Kiwi guy called Bob, who had a friend that had just come back from Spain and walked something called El Camino de Santiago, which, as I say, I hadn't heard anything about. And we got chatting about it. And the following day, when I got back home to the UK, I did a lot of research on it. And about 3 days after that, I was flying out to Lyon in France to start my Camino, and I did a route called the Via Pedensis, which starts in Le Puy-en-Velay in France. It's about 500 miles to the French-Spanish border, where I linked in with the Camino Francais, which I'm sure your viewers and listeners are more than aware of, which was the further 500 miles to Santiago in Spain. So that's how I did my first one, or the story behind it.
Okay. And what did you find the differences between, say, the Le Puy Camino, the first 500 miles in France, versus the Camino Francis in Spain? Describe what you found.
Apart from the cultural differences, I found France a lot more like England geographically. It was a lot greener. It's kind of gently rolling hills. Spain was kind of how I anticipated it, really. I sort of imagined it sort of the opposite of France in terms of geography. I expected more hills. I expected it to be a lot drier, dustier, kind of that more kind of sandy, rocky environment, which it was. Although in Galicia, the last state, it's kind of the opposite of that. It's really green. It almost reminded me of places in England and Ireland. Apart from that, apart from the geographical differences and obviously the language and the food you're eating and the opening hours and that sort of thing, it was just a similar experience. You know, I some of the time I walked on my own, some of the time I walked with others. I was walking with people in Spain that I'd met near the beginning of the hike. I'd say one of the big differences I did note was it was more easier to get accommodation in Spain with the refuges, although there's plenty of chances to bed down for the night in France. They were normally in the forms of kind of cheap bed and breakfasts, a few hostels.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit more expensive in France, but Spain is a lot more geared up in places to stay overnight. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of refuges, so it was a lot easier in that respect.
Okay. And when you completed that first Camino, did you come to any conclusions or decisions in your mind about your life, or you were going back to England, I believe? So did anything change?
I did go back to England for about a week, and then I flew to Florida to work on an organic farm for 3 months, which gave me plenty of time to reminisce, I suppose, on the Camino. I decided, A, I wanted to do a lot more hiking. B, I didn't want to do any more jobs that I was fed up with doing. It was, I guess a lot of us are stuck in jobs we don't really like, which is kind of understandable because we've got families to feed, etc. But one of the decisions I made was to stop doing things that didn't make me unhappy but weren't exciting me. And a big part of that was what I was doing at the time. I can't remember what I was doing for work back then, but so I decided, A, to go self-employed, and I spent a few years decorating. But the big decision I made, apart from trying to do things that made me more happy, was to write a book. And I've wanted to write a book for years and never had anything that I thought was interesting enough to write about. And suddenly I'd done the Camino, and I had this like 4 diaries of my memories and all the notes and everything that had happened to me. And I looked at it and thought, there's a book in that. And that's when I started writing. I started writing it on the farm in Florida in 2001. And it took me 9 years, not because I was literally writing every day and it took 9 years. I think I wrote 80% of it in Florida, and then I just left it.
Yes.
And picked it up again the beginning of 2010 as a New Year's resolution to finish it, and I finished it that year.
Very good. So that book is called The Journey in Between.
Yeah.
And that was your first book that came out.
It was, yes.
Okay. So in your books and your bio, you talk about being a thru-hiker. So what does that mean? Is that an extreme hiker, or is that somebody who goes long distances or goes solo? Maybe talk about what that means to people.
I think the definitions vary, but they kind of adhere to one common trend. And as an attempt to describe it, it's walking a long distance trail in one continuous attempt. I believe a lot of people tag in one calendar year on the end of it. So descriptions of long distance vary. I mean, to some people 100 miles is to them long distance because they don't walk. To other people it might be 500, it might be 1,000 or more. I wouldn't really know how to classify long distance. To me, I suppose 500 or more would be long distance, but a lot of these hikes, particularly the long ones in the States, take several months to complete. So I don't know, it's a difficult one. I know for sure that it's supposed to be hiking one trail in one continuous attempt. So then when your distance, again, it varies according to the person you're speaking to.
So then I think around that time you decided to do a much longer trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, which is kind of over 2,600 miles long.
Yeah.
Your book out of that was The Last Englishman. So to me, that sounds like it's a totally different experience than the Camino trails in Europe. So maybe tell us a little bit about the Pacific Crest Trail and why it was so challenging and what drew you to it.
It is a completely different experience. I mean, when I set out to do the Camino, I never thought I'd be able to walk 500 miles, let alone the 1,000 I did on the Camino. And having done it, I just kind of upped up my sort of targets. Once we are aware of what we're capable of, we kind of look at how we can do to improve it. I chose the Pacific Crest Trail for a couple of reasons. It was either the toss-up was either the Pacific Crest Trail or the Appalachian Trail, which most long-distance hikers kind of go for. It's probably the most famous. It's the classic. A lot of people do it every year. It basically all came down to the weather, to be honest. The Appalachian Trail's got a reputation for being very wet. And my idea of, I mean, all hikers walk in the rain at some point, but for the reports I've read about the Appalachian Trail, kind of put me off from the rainfall it gets.
Yes.
And the Pacific Crest Trail, it's a lot drier. I mean, I'm not saying you're never going to get wet on it. Of course you are, but the climate in terms of rainfall is a lot kinder. And it's longer, obviously. It's 2,600 miles, which takes anywhere. I mean, the fastest hikers, well, I think the fastest at the moment is something crazy like 60 days, but your average hiker will take between 3.5 to 6 months, something like that. So it certainly put the targets way up. I mean, it's two and a half Caminos. And the other thing was the geography, the landscape. You start off, the first 700 miles is what the Americans would classify as desert. So there's very little rainfall, there's very little water. And then it kind of hits, this is all through California. Then it hits Oregon, where you kind of hit the forests and the big mountains. And then finally Washington, where there's even more forest and more mountains. But it was just the variedness of the terrain, and going up into places like the High Sierra, where we're just up in the mountains for weeks. So you've got these distinct stages, which are so different to the previous one and the other one to follow on. So there was a lot of reasons, but that's why I settled on the Pacific Crest Trail.
So obviously, as you know, and our listeners will know, the Camino is quite sociable. There's always a place to sit down and have a cup of coffee and a chat or a glass of wine when you finish your day's walk, and there's all hostels and albergues. I don't think that's the same with the Pacific Crest. I think it's more solo, lonely, kind of camping type trail. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a lot. I did the Pacific Crest Trail in 2010, and I think the amount of registered hikers was something like 220. I haven't looked at the latest figures. I think the last time I looked for a couple of years ago, it was up to 2,500, 3,000. I think the popularity has increased because of films and books like Wild and yes, the general long distance hiking bug. I've forgotten the question, sorry.
I suppose it sounds like a very lonely kind of solo.
Yes, so there's less people, that is the main thing. But I mean, the Camino, there's, again, I forget the figures. The last time I looked, I think 250,000 people have done it in this period from sort of March, April through to September. So the amount of people that do the Camino is way, way higher than the Pacific Crest Trail even now. But the Camino, you obviously never have any, you don't have a problem meeting people. The Pacific Crest Trail, despite the fewer amount of people on it, because we all started at this 2-week window at the end of April, yes, which is considered optimal to get up into the mountains because of snowfall and that sort of thing. So we call it a bubble. It was so this group of 250 hikers in this 2-week period, and we kept kind of overlapping everybody. And if anything, you think you wouldn't see anybody, but you get to meet a lot of familiar faces. Some people I walked with for half a day, some people a day, some people I walked with for a month or so. And just touching on that, I see a lot of questions, or a common question on the Camino forums on places like Facebook is, I'm a lone woman, or indeed even a lone man, and some people go out there purely for the solitude and have no issues walking alone. But a lot of people are scared of going out and doing these things, or especially the Camino on their own. And the best advice is you're not going to be alone, because even if you go out there alone, even on day one, as soon as you get to wherever you're starting from, whether that be St. Jean, Peter Paul, or wherever, you're going to meet people, and usually within a couple of days you know a handful of people you walk with. So don't be scared of going out alone, and don't be afraid of being alone when you're out there. You won't be.
What was the I suppose the hardest moment on that Pacific Crest Trail, or the worst moment, or the lowest moment, or the challenging moment for you?
I never had any problem with solitude, because it doesn't bother me at all. In fact, I revel in it. So the days, I think I had a day in the Sierras where I didn't see anybody for 4 days. And if anything, I actually loved that. Not that I got anything against people, but I just enjoyed the solitude on it. I had some issues where I was coming off a peak called a pass called Forester Pass, which is the highest point on the entire trail. I think the elevation is just shy of 13,000 feet or something. And I'd read a lot about something called post-holing, which is where the snow melts. Normally you're walking along the top, but as it melts, it becomes more unstable. And a lot of the times, not just a foot, but a whole leg will go down and get caught between rocks, and you sprain and break things. And I did fall through, getting towards the bottom of Forester Pass. Thankfully, it wasn't serious. I bloodied my knee and I cut it. Thankfully, I didn't break anything. Had a couple of instances with water supply where I misjudged it. So, you know, I was walking about a 35-degree heat, and I think I had to walk 15 miles with half a litre of water. That wasn't very funny at all. A lot of snake encounters, a lot of bear encounters, especially a bear encounter late one evening. I was camped on the side of a mountain, and there was food all around me, which is not a good idea. And I just felt or heard something coming down through the bush above me. And it plonked down on the trail about 10 feet away. It's pitch black, but I could make out the outline of a bear. Didn't know what to do. Just stood there looking at each other for about a minute. And eventually I just did what we're supposed to do, raised my arms, made a lot of noise. And it looked at me for about another minute, and then just kind of strolled us down the hill. So I think my biggest fear was snakes and bears, but having seen both of them several times, you understand them a lot more, and you certainly respect them a lot more. So I'm glad I saw both of them on plenty of occasions.
Okay, very good. And then I think the next year or pretty soon afterwards, you decided to do the Appalachian Trail as well.
Yeah, that was 2 years after the PCT, so 2012. And despite all my fears of the Appalachian Trail, I think we had one of the best summers ever on the Appalachian Trail. I think 2012, if you speak to hikers that did it that year, they'll say, yeah, we didn't get much rain at all. And I certainly didn't get much. So I mean, I got a fair share, but most of my memories of it are sunshine and fluffy white clouds for the whole route.
Yeah.
Except for the start, it was a bit cold. But yeah, I did that. I think I did it in a day under 5 months, which is about average for the trail. Met a lot of fantastic people. And that too it's a wonderful trail. Some people say it's harder than the Pacific Crest Trail. It's shorter, but I think I'm right in saying there's more elevation loss and gain on the Appalachian Trail than there is on the Pacific Crest Trail, because the Appalachian Trail is literally just up, down, up, down, up, down, yeah. Up, down. So some people consider it a lot harder. It's certainly a tough one.
Okay. So and you've written a book about that as well. It's called Balancing on Blue. So you've now got 3 books: the Camino, the Pacific Crest Trail, and the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah. And
I believe it's around this time, 2010, 11, 12, when you first started realizing or experiencing depression. And that leads us on to the topic of your next book. But can you maybe talk about that a little bit? How it happened, what it did to you, or why you think you had depression? Was that driving you to do these trails, or vice versa? I wasn't. I did a hike across Scotland, which I'm sure we'll come on to, which was a pretty torrid affair. I mean, Scotland was beautiful. The trail was amazing. But
psychologically, I was an absolute mess. My emotions were all over the place. I had absolutely no reason why. I was aware something was wrong and seriously wrong with my head. And it wasn't until I got back that I realised, or the doctor diagnosed that I had depression. And at that point, I realised that although that was a particularly bad time, it did kind of rekindle memories stretching back to, I think, about 2010, and certainly on the Pacific Crest Trail, when I had a lot of mood swings, a lot of emotions, and I never really realized at the time, because they weren't severe. They happened very often, and they weren't anything that made me sort of unduly concerned. And I just thought it was, emotions because I was out hiking and you're tired and all this sort of thing. So I never paid any attention to them. But after walking across Scotland and experiencing my depression then, I did make connections to similar events back in 2010. So I think in 2015, when I was on a Scottish hike, I think I'd been suffering it for about 10 years. And obviously it was on a steady decline, as in getting worse. And I think the months following, when I got back from Scotland, so I think this is 2015. So from July to January of 2016, I was a complete mess, absolute mess. I knew at that point I had depression, and I was struggling to deal with it, but I did eventually managed to understand it and took steps to make myself better. I still get it, but it's far less often because of the steps I've taken, and it's far less severe. I'd say almost to the fact that I know I have it. I have bad days, but nowhere near as bad as it was sort of 6 years ago.
So I think your book called High and Low, which was your story about hiking through Scotland, that was not intended as a book about depression, but I think as you returned, you kind of decided to change it from a travel book to kind of a story about your feelings, your depression, how you cope with it. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I kind of like it to think of it as a mix. So if you enjoy hiking, you'd probably enjoy it. And if I won't say if you enjoy depression, obviously you don't, but if you wanted to hear a story about depression, then there's that side of it as well. So it's kind of a two-part approach. I hadn't anticipated it to be about depression at all. It was going to be another hiking book about walking across Scotland. But when I sat down to write it, I wrote the first chapter. And then sort of reading my notes, so I kept a diary, as I do with all my walks, so a day-by-day chronological event, so I know what's happened and it jogs my memory. And just reading forward to take in notes and events to write chapter 2, I realised most of my diary was about depression and how my head was and how I was feeling and my moods and my emotions and my unhappiness. And at that point, I started weaving the depression in, and I finished chapter 2, and then I thought you just have to follow on with this trend, write about the hiking side of it, but also write about the depression as well. And it was hard. I mean, it's hard to write about emotions truthfully because you have to open up, and you kind of wonder if that how people are going to feel when they read it. And some of it is kind of quite opening, and a lot of it I thought twice about writing about because you are opening yourself up. But the feedback was fantastic. I think it's in terms of reviews and stuff, it's got the most decent or better reviews than all my books, and I think that's why, just because of this honesty thing. But the feedback's been fantastic, especially from people who suffered with depression and have just sort of turned around and said thank you.
Yeah.
So it was a good decision. It certainly made it worthwhile doing.
And do you think what you wrote, was that news to people, your friends, your family, people who knew you, or did they already know and you were just kind of explaining to them truthfully for the first time?
No, I didn't tell anyone I mean, I told close friends and family, but there was a stigma even back in 2015 towards depression. Although we were talking about it, there was still this stigma attached to it, that if you think you've got it, that there's something wrong with you and it's your fault. And it's obviously not that case at all. It's something you have don't have a huge amount of control over. So I did tell people, close family, friends, and I thought, well, when the book's out, then everybody's going to know. So I did get a lot of emails and calls from people that knew me and didn't know that, I had this depression thing. But yeah.
Okay. Do you have any advice for people now in 2020, 2021? I expect there's a lot more people than normal experiencing kind of feelings of depression or being locked in or kind of not able to do things. Do you have any advice or observations on what people might be going through in the current pandemic?
I think it's, yeah, especially with the pandemic and people being, holed up at the moment in lockdown. I don't know if I think it's obviously causing a lot of people to have depression. And I think it's a two-pronged thing as well, that a lot of people have depression, and it's now that it's acceptable to talk about it. And there's a lot more people that are talking about it. I mean, advice, I can only really advise on what I did. And my frame of mind was I didn't want to take antidepressants, which seems to be the logical choice. I know a lot of people do, and I know a lot of people benefit from it, and I wouldn't advise against not taking them. But I didn't want to take it for the very simple reason that we don't know what causes depression. We have ideas, but there's no research proof what causes it at the moment. We've got a pretty good idea, but none of it's really been proven. So my argument was, how can I take a pill that supposedly alleviates depression when we don't even know what causes it? It didn't make any sense to me. And plus there was the side effects and the addiction issues with antidepressants. So I just went on Google and researched. I can't remember what I typed in, but I think I just typed in something like natural ways to alleviate depression. And I ended up with a 15-point list covering everything from the obvious ones like diet, exercise, sunlight, even down to stuff you can eat, supplements and this sort of thing. And I whittled it all down to this 15-point list, which is in the back of High and Low, the book. Or if anybody wants to email me this after this interview, I'm more than happy to email it to them. And I followed it. I mean, I don't follow every single point strictly every single day, but I cover most of them every single day. And within a week, I noticed a huge difference. I think the big issues for me was I was drinking a lot of the time, and as soon as I stopped drinking, that was a marked difference. And I think if you see a doctor, I don't know if they're trained to ask this question, but I think there's strong links with alcohol and depression. I.e., if you drink a lot of alcohol, there's a reasonable chance that you either suffer or you will suffer from depression. So the one thing I can say is, drink doesn't make it better. In fact, drink, if anything, will kick that sort of thing off. But
okay, that's some good advice there. So after that, I think you almost turned your back on kind of long distance hiking, or you lost interest in it.
Not last year, 2019. I flew out to Spain to do a Camino walk, and I got about 2 weeks into it, and I was feeling all right, but there was a lot of questions in my head, and the question which kept coming up, as if someone was constantly prodding me in the side, is, do you really want to do this anymore? Which is kind of a strange thing to be thinking about, because I was doing something I loved. But I kind of, I looked into it or thought about it for a few days, and I thought, no, I don't actually want to do this anymore, which is a bit of a shocker. But emotionally, I mean, your head's trying to tell you one thing and your heart's trying to tell you another. And I'll always follow my heart. I listen to my head, but my heart's normally right. So I flew back home and made the decision to stop long distance hiking, and it wasn't a physical thing. It was, the best way I can just explain it is as we kind of go through life, we have these interests. So it might be long distance hiking, might be knitting, might be wine tasting, it might be riding your bike, it might be horse riding, whatever. And I think in my experience, I've kind of tried them out. So some things I'll try for a couple of days and I think, no, that's not really for me. Some things will last for maybe 6 months, a couple of years, and I enjoy doing them. And then I can't explain it. I just sort of lose interest in it. And that's what happened with through hiking. The passion wasn't there anymore. I was in a situation where I was forcing myself to do something that I didn't want to do anymore. That said, I've said a lot of things in my life where I'm not going to do something, and the following year I go out and do them. So, I mean, I'm still hiking. I do the South Downs Way every year, which is like a tradition now, but I'm still hiking just the long distance stuff. But as I say, in 2 years' time, I might completely reverse the decision and go and do some long hike somewhere. I don't know, but for the time being, yeah, I'm.
It's tricky for somebody who probably the last number of years has made a living out of writing books about hiking. So what do you do if you don't hike? Yeah, that was obviously a major factor in it when I decided that. I thought, well, I haven't got anything to hike about, but nothing to write about. But so I don't know. I mean, I might write another memoir. I'm into my bicycles at the moment. I've always loved my bikes as well as my hikes. So I do a lot of road riding, a lot of gravel riding. I went for a 5-6 week tour around France yesterday, down to Switzerland. So last year on the bike packing, thoroughly enjoyed that. And I've got more long distance bike packing plans as well. So maybe there'll be a book out of that. One thing I have learned about writing is if you're not passionate about it, it's not going to be a very good book. So I'm not going to force myself on that issue. And I believe that kind of future plan may involve cycling the old Silk Road from China back to the UK. Yeah, this is, I think, something that's about 10 years off, but I have a friend who I went cycling touring in '94, showing my age there. And he's always had a passion or a deep interest in the Silk Road, which is an old trading route from China. I think it's from China to Istanbul, where they used to trade, the silks, the spices, all that sort of thing. And we want to fly out to China and ride back to Istanbul. I can't even remember the distance, but it is something crazy. And at that point, we decided if we're going to do that and get to Istanbul, we might as well ride from Istanbul back to London. It doesn't make sense to fly there. So, yeah, this is probably maybe 8 years away, but yeah, that's the plan. It's something we both like to do. So, and certainly I hope there's a book in it. Yeah, definitely. And I think it's great to have a kind of plan like that, especially during these difficult times, to have something to really kind of look forward to and imagine doing something crazy. Yeah, it's nice to have dreams. Yeah, fantastic. Well, listen, Keith, I really appreciate your time. I think your story is very interesting. You've got the 4 books available, and we'll post them on our page. And I think the conversation about depression, I think, was very, very kind of useful, and hopefully it will help some people. So I appreciate your time, and I look forward to talking to you again in the future. No problem, Sean. Nice talking to you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.